What's up, y'all? My name is Trevor Wendt. I'm a visual artist raised in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I make art to challenge perspectives and give hope to the marginalized and oppressed. In this space, Durag Thoughts is a space where we talk about ideas and concepts and conversations about things that do just that, challenge perspectives and give hope to the marginalized and oppressed. And we're continuing on in Durag Thoughts Season 2, talking through my project, City of God, and rocking through the series as it releases. And today we're going to be talking about the track Heritage of Hate, but also the interlude of Heritage of Hate is kind of lumped within that. They're kind of one collective piece. And so, you had a little bit of a jump in the podcast in terms of an episode that was different than album rollout, track specific stuff last week. And so now we're rocking through Heritage of Hate and kind of the story around that. And I'm excited to talk about this today. But my conversation partner today is a minister, a friend that I met at a coffee shop out in Raleigh just a couple of years ago at this point. He was working at a church as a minister there and then moved towards some church planting efforts and is now back in Houston in the midst of this COVID season and is doing some ministry work out there. And so I want to introduce y'all to my friend, Andre Franklin. Dre, I appreciate you, dog.
Grace and peace, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, dog.
Excited.
So today we're going to talk about Heritage of Hate. So to give everyone a background, just a quick background to the story surrounding that piece. I was working at a church in East Tennessee, and I'm not sure what time of year this was, but it was warm, and it was around the time where Justin Bieber had released his Purpose album, and I was absolutely listening. It was like my first Justin Bieber album that I fully listened to, and I was like, yo, this album is crazy. And so, yo, that Purpose album's crazy, and honestly, that Intentions joint is growing on me. But I was listening to Justin Bieber with the car windows rolled down. I had gotten a table from an antique store that I was gonna refinish because I wasn't making much money at the time. I was making like $11,000 a year working part-time at this church. And I was posted up in this kind of, I don't know if I'd call it a loft, but I talked about this within the Johnson Street track episode, but I was living in kind of this Airbnb type like apartment suite thing in this big house by myself that one of my professors had owned, but him and his family had moved out of. And so I didn't have much money, but spaces are really important to me, as people can kind of tell from how I design even this space, right? And so I decided that I was going to do this antique store thing, get a table, refinish it, had sanded it, had leveled it, had done everything that I needed to have like a decent coffee table. And I needed to get some wood stain to get it the way that I wanted it. And so I decided after church one Sunday that I was going to go to this Lowe's to get this wood stain. And I go into the Lowe's parking lot and I pull in and, just bumping the Bieber, like just having a good Sunday, man. I was chilling. And then I look up and I see a Confederate flag, like this truck with a Confederate flag, a prisoner of war flag, a don't tread on me flag, and an American flag, like all four sitting in the layout of the truck, right?
Kill the vibe.
Absolutely killing the vibe, right? And so I see that, and any time in East Tennessee where I see a Confederate flag on a truck or a car or whatever, I instantly make a decision to not park there. Like I usually spot them way earlier. I don't park close to them because you just don't know what type of person you're going to deal with. And I don't put myself in unnecessary harm's way. And so they decided, or like I decided at this point, it's like I could park somewhere else and come in a different entrance, or I could just walk to the front. And so I decided that I was going to walk to the front of this place. I was just going to, suck it up and go.
Push through, sure.
Yeah, and just push through the moment, push through the potential discomfort, right? So I decide on that, and I start walking to the front of this place. And as I'm getting close to the back of the truck, I kind of size it up, and then I see the taillights like light up. And so I'm like, frick, someone's in this car. And it wasn't like I stood there for like some extended period of time and was sitting there like looking around the truck. I just walking past, sized it up, see these taillights, like, whoa, try to get out of there, right? And then the window rolls down and this woman starts, popping off at me and is like, you need to slow down when you're going through that parking lot, like real aggressive, like, and it's, and I'm like, like, yo, what in the world is going on right now? And some people might trivialize that moment, but like, I was not speeding, and I'm aware enough and have experienced enough as a Black man in America to know that the situation wasn't about me speeding through the parking lot or me how I was driving. Like, it wasn't about my driving habits. It was about starting some ish with me to incite something else. And so I didn't know what was gonna pop off in that situation, but I knew that there was a power trip going on. And so I could either like stay in the midst of that situation, or I could chuck deuces and like keep walking into the store and kind of reclaim my power in a sense. Like, you're not gonna have this power over me kind of ideology. And so I kind of sneered and kept walking. And so that's kind of the background story of like what that track was written around. And there's a bunch of metaphors and stuff like that I display in what I actually write, but because I think there's a larger narrative at play. But it was very much so like a wild, like a bugged out moment. Like, this lady was really trying to start some ish with me in the middle of a Sunday and in a Lowe's parking lot in East Tennessee, in Bristol, Tennessee.
Or asserting that asserting dominance, man. The idea of, I can tell you what to do, as if this is your neighborhood. Like, it's this idea of like having the audacity to say to a random person, like, has no clue who you are. The idea of, you need to slow down in the parking lot. It's like, am I a child? Like who am I? You know what I'm saying, at this moment. So I think that's very interesting. I think it speaks well to what you talked about in Heritage of Hate. And I think, as those who watch, man, that interlude was really dope. And I would say really kind of warmed me up, and kind of opened me up to receive the message of Heritage of Hate. Well, I was reading a book called Stand Your Ground, and what it was talking about was this idea of the origins of America, and how like Anglo-Saxonism was like this essential ideology that really threads what I would say a lot of Christianity today, where it's this kind of quasi, we want to build a city on a hill. America is our city on a hill. Thomas Jefferson loved Anglo-Saxonism, studied the language, believed that they created the beautiful society. And not just that, but then you have, and Thomas Jefferson really, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, like these very ideas that continue to really, I would say, permeate American Christianity. And I'm not even going to just leave it solely to what people would say white evangelicalism. I would say it's threaded throughout just anybody who has come to faith in America at
Yeah.
some level, unfortunately, has this kind of quasi sort of Christianity, but not really, kind of just kind of piecing and taking the idea of Israel and parsing them up. And, you know, leads to statements like Franklin Graham saying, you know, America's, our Christians are losing the grip of America, was kind of the sentiment of a statement he made. And I think, you know, people have to understand that history dictates destiny, so to speak. History dictates you moving forward, and history has voices and has meaning and has effects, and I think what America doesn't understand, or what people are trying to get their mind around, is this idea of how long ago supposed slavery was, and why Black people feel the way they do in America, you know. And I think, yeah, you know.
Well, that makes me think about, before, you know, not to cut you off, but like to kind of touch in on what you were saying there, is like, it makes me think about this concept of historical forgetfulness. One of my seminary professors like had written an essay a couple years back about this sort of concept. You know, white dude named Dr. Jason Bembry, and Dr. Bembry had written this article. He's a Harvard grad, Harvard theological grad. I think that's what their schools call. Different seminaries have different, they always end up with different names like that are kind of variations of the same couple of things, but grad of Harvard within their like theological studies, and was a student of Dr. Cornel West. And so he was talking about like this concept of historical forgetfulness, about how like there's this intention in America to like try to forget the evil history, right? Like, it's to gloss over slavery, it's to gloss over the Trail of Tears, it's to gloss over the continued expansion of America and the robbing of land from indigenous peoples. It's to gloss over, you know, things like, you know, the Tulsa race riot and the bombing of Black Wall Street. You know, it's to look at those moments and try to like make them distant. Even there was something recent that really kind of rocked me in a way that I never had thought about. Was, I think the lady's name is Hannah Belcher, that I'd seen this tweet from, but she was like, can we stop only posting black and white images of the civil rights movement, acting like it was a million years ago when this happened? Like, she was like, Ruby Bridges is still alive and lives down the street from me.
Alive today, for sure.
Shout out Ruby Bridges. If you peer into Heritage of Hate, you might find a reference to her. But you know, she's like, Ruby Bridges lives down the street from me, and so she started posting like a bunch of Gordon Parks images from that era, which Gordon Parks shot plenty of black and white stills within that era as well, but some of his color images in that era and from marches and things like that. And it really does kind of rip you out of this like, oh, I can act like this is some antiquated, distant thing, and I can pull this into the future and say, like, and pull this into the current and say, oh, damn, this was 5 minutes ago. Like,
straight up, yeah, 100%.
Like, my mom grew up through this entire era, you know?
Yeah.
And so we don't have to go back very far to get into these eras of oppression. My grandma couldn't vote until she was in her 30s, cuz. Like, that's all. Like, people don't get how close this stuff was. And like, my grandma just died 2 years ago. Like,
Yeah.
and she was in her 80s. So in literally 2 generations, black women like couldn't vote, and like black people couldn't vote. And then we were still dealing with voter suppression up through, if you watch the movie Selma, like you can see some of that, you know, Ava DuVernay's Selma, and see some of that happening in the 60s, late 60s. But yeah, go Dre.
No, yeah, no, I would even say, right, we're still dealing with voter suppression now, right?
Yep.
And
I did a project on it. Right there.
Yeah, right. But it's this idea of, you know, and I would even, you know, mass incarceration contributes to that. The idea of not having voting rights, being used as free labor. You know, the thing about America, you know, I was talking to my parents, and yeah, you know, my mom was just, she's kind of, it seems like she's in this place where she's kind of waking back up to these realities that they're very close and around the corner. And, you know, for her growing up, it got to a point where she is, you know, her parents and her grandparents who raised her, that they were just trying to make it. You know, they were not, you know, trying to have confrontation. They were just trying to make it. It was like, let us just get out of here alive, you know, like let that just happen. And what we see now, especially with social media, this abhorrent violence, man, that permeates the American culture. I think the heritage of hate is really essential, is the essential thing to name, right? Like, I think we have to name that idea, because it's really an ideology, right? I mean, when you look at even, and we talk about this all the time, when you look even at the slave revolts, it was almost this hate that was built on top of blocks and bricks of fear. You know, it was, you know, this idea of lesser, which, you know, come from historical ideas of, you know, the idea, how do you control a people? How do you, you know, oppress people, all those things. But one of the most essential things that we see, man, is that this nation that we know was built on hate, was built on raping and pillaging and taking, you know, like stealing, you know, and the very irony, when you see the old birth of a nation, you see this idea of a fear of Black people, Black bodies, specifically Black males wanting to steal women, wanting to rape and pillage and do those things. But the very irony was that the slaveholders did that to Black people.
Yep.
African people, Black women, raped them, split them up with from their families. Didn't matter if they were married, you know, like all these things. The very irony is that the heritage of hate that is kind of imposed on Black people whenever you're in, you know, an elevator, or you're close to, not in this pandemic time, but when you're close to somebody, they might get nervous and clutch their purse, or they might get nervous and kind of move to the side. You know, there's this idea of, it's like, yo, we are not as violent as you might think. And historically, we should be afraid of you a little bit more than you're afraid of us, which I would say is what we're seeing kind of unfold right now, man. I mean, like, bro, there's a desire in me just to have peace as a Black male. Like, as a Black body, I just want to live in peace. And I don't foresee that ever happening, you know? Like, it's like if you get stopped by the police, if you comply with the police, you still might get shot. Like it's possible.
Yeah.
Now statistically, right? I mean, there's statistics out where proportionally white people get shot by the police more than black people. It still doesn't justify the lack of honoring the experience in the historical context in which we've experienced oppression in America.
Well, it's really important on that note, though, to like pinpoint that, like, when we're talking about like white people being killed or shot, like enduring police violence more than black people, if we consider that numerically, and then we consider that by the ratios, black people are 2 times as likely to be experiencing violence from police than white people are. Because, I mean, just think about it, everybody. Like, there are a lot more white people in America than there are black people, and so we have to consider per capita. And then if you look at indigenous peoples, it's even more than us. Like, I think they're almost twice as likely as us to experience violence from the police, because we're dealing with ratios, and that's very like, that's a very potent reality, and it's a defense that is necessary to know when you're talking about these concepts, because that's one of the first things that you're going to get someone who is some apologist for, like, apologist for, I guess you would say apologist for police brutality, because it's not like it's like just straight up an apologist for the police. Like, it's a straight up, like, you're an apologist for, like, oh, but like this was necessary, or like, oh, you brought this on yourselves, and why do y'all commit so much crime, and this, that, and the third. And it's like, okay, you're gonna make all these excuses for shooting people, like obvious, like this, there's something wrong here. But and then the last thing I'll say, to kind of note into what you were talking about, within the power dynamics and stuff, it's like there's nothing that a slave holder feared more than a slave revolt. Me and my nephew were talking about this just a couple days ago. It's like, so everything was like centered around this fear that black people were gonna turn up and repay even a fraction of what was done to us. And so you see this incredible amount of fear mongering because of this fear that black people are gonna do something. Cat Williams talked about it in his little Supreme New York little dialogue thing that he did. Like, for the brand Supreme, they dropped a video recently, where Cat was kind of like, it seemed like he was gonna do some stand up, but he had this dialogue where he really talked about what it, like, this current state of being black in America, and some of the stuff that we're rocking through collectively. And so he was really jumping through some of that stuff. And one of the things that he said, he's like, something around the lines of like, you fear that we're gonna basically like turn up and repay y'all for like the stuff that we've done. He said, we're better people than that. We've proven that we're like, that's not what we're gonna do. We're better people than that. And I think we have historically proven, there have definitely been times where it's like, yo, enough is enough, and like we've rioted over things. But I don't know. I mean, like, you keep pushing people to breaking points, and you're gonna break a levee at some point. You're gonna break a dam. Like, the people I told, like, one of my like childhood friends is a police officer, longest standing friend that I have, and we were having a conversation and about just like via like IG DMs or something, and one of the things we were talking about was honing in on, I'm of the mindset to defund the police and to work towards abolishing to the point of like creating a different entity that doesn't have the history that the police have in reshaping how this thing looks, because the police are created concept, and just like everything else, and we could try something else. Like, it's not, to me, it's not that big of a deal. But because I don't think it's that complicated. That was the measure that we created to deal with crime. You could try something else. And obviously there's a really
historically, all right.
Oh yeah,
bro.
Historically there's a very tattered history with the police. And so we were talking about some stuff, and I think I was talking about, like, why the heck explain to me, like, financially, why police need tanks? Like, why do they need, like, these massive, like, why do they need military grade weaponry? Which, if you read the book The New Jim Crow, there's Michelle Alexander talks about some of those things about incentivization and the war on drugs for different police departments to get gifted military grade equipment by the government. But read that book and you'll learn more about it. But so we were talking about that, and he had said something about, like, dealing with, like, some of the levels of, like, weaponry and stuff that they need. Part of it was to deal with, like, riots of the day. And I was like, let's be real, cuh. If like, Officer Chauvin or whatever had not stuck his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes almost, we wouldn't even have gotten to the point of the Minneapolis riots. We wouldn't have gotten there. So that was incited by y'all. Like, that's your squad. That's blue, cuh. And so, like, y'all gotta take that L, because we wouldn't even be here. We would not even be in this space of, like, massive rioting. Like, we wouldn't even have gotten to the riots in those spaces in that revolt, if y'all had not been tripping. Like, if this cat had not been tripping. So you gotta take that L.
Yeah, I think my wife and I, we were talking about how in love with violence we are as a culture. How in love with this idea, and specifically hip hop, right, or rap. Currently, it's just like, man, and some people are sharing their experiences, and some people are, just trying to work through their life and trying to figure out things, right? But it's this idea of, like, you see, and not even just in hip hop and movies, and my dad loves, like, Spider-Man and like other, like Star Wars, all these things that are like very violent, like vehemently, like they're violent, right? And so, like, for me, I'm like we don't know. And I think this is why, like, the idea of police is, like, being abolished is so inconceivable, right? It's because we don't know how to deal with anything other than using force, other than using violence and more violence and more violence, or more power and more power. And that's just what we're used to as an American context and culture. And within that context and culture, and this is where you're starting to see the polarization, because for the most part, right, I would say in the public sphere, it's fairly lopsided within who is for the police and who is maybe questioning the idea of the police, and who is like, yo, we need to get these police up out of here. I would say it's fairly clear, the distinctions. But what really gets me, and because, like, I think we're here for validation at some level, for people to understand, yo, this is a real experience, and these things are factual. Like, the police have never been good to Black Americans and Black and brown Americans. Police have never been good to us, historically. You're looking at the over militarization, but then the lack of justice when things happen. And that's not just, historically Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, that's James Baldwin, that's not just back in the day. That is Trayvon Martin. That is multiple black and brothers and sisters. And I specifically say Trayvon Martin because it really resembled almost an Emmett Till like kind of, it just triggered me to think of Emmett Till, of this idea of like black bodies are so dispensable that a kid can be walking down the street with Skittles and a sweet tea, and there can be a neighborhood watch person that thinks he's suspicious and that has a gun and can shoot a kid and not be held accountable.
Yeah.
And I would say not only does our desire and almost hunger and thirst for violence and to see more violent movies and to see more violent things happen, that bubbles over to vigilantism, which, you know, again, you know, we talk about, it bubbles over to that idea of good versus evil. And if you're a vigilante and your lens fears all people who don't look like you, that's an issue. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not an ideal situation for people who look like us in this world. And I think, you know, I struggle to say, especially within the church, man, like the whiteness is almost synonymous with Christianity. You know, like, which historically makes no sense. But like within America, like when you think Christian, you think white. And for me, as when I was studying in school, as I was reading the scriptures, man, even though I knew they were Hebrew and Jewish, and you know, you had Africans or Ethiopians, you know, you had people that were of color and nobody that was necessarily white in the scriptures. That wasn't stated to me, and nor did I make that assumption. Does that make sense? So it was a lot of like, oh, I'm thinking white people. I'm thinking Augustine. I'm thinking, you know, he's light skinned. You know, like I'm thinking all, because the books and how they look and the whitewashing of history. And so you're like, everything in this world at some level, unless you're in a overt and predominantly black community, is designed to show you that you are lesser. We didn't start having black superheroes until when, you know what I'm saying? like everybody was live about Black Panther, right? Because it was like, yo, like finally, you know what I'm saying? Like we got some representation.
Yeah, I mean, you get like moments like Spawn was a black superhero, but Spawn was masked and you didn't see him most of the time. And then you got like Miles Morales with Spider-Man, you know, with that kind of new generation of him. You do get that shift, but like, the representation space is super important, because it's, you know, the picture of Jesus that we've seen, you know, is a white Jesus that's, you know, propaganda, a spoken word poet rapper would say that that's just Michelangelo's boyfriend. Like, that's not Jesus. And so, you know, you have those sort of tensions in like the visuals, the storybooks, the felt graphs, or the felt whatever things that they use in little Sunday schools were, that are all displaying these individuals as white. And so like when you think Jesus, you think white dude with really long brown hair and a big old beard, you know, that looks like Jared Leto or Leto, whatever his last name is, however you pronounce it. No disrespect, I just don't know how to pronounce it. But like looks like him rather than looking like, you know, a Middle Eastern person with curlier hair and a darker skin tone. But going back real fast to like your thought in the space of like police never being good to us, that Trayvon example, like, you know, Trayvon's a little bit different because he wasn't killed by police, but like I think a really comparable example within that space would be Tamir Rice. You know, with it, like someone saying, yo, this this kid in the park has his gun. It looks like it could be fake. You know, you basically like just go check on the situation. And then within 2 seconds of being on scene, this officer shoots and kills Tamir Rice. And so it's like this suspicion, this fear of black people, even going down to this like 11-year-old kid. I think that's how old Tamir was when he was murdered.
Yeah.
And
He was young.
this officer was not held accountable. And so we've seen this heritage of hate permeate so many environments. You talk about the church, like
Justice system.
you know, we look at chaplains on slave ships, right? Like that was a thing. We look at I said recently that our ancestors, like Negro spirituals, were the true worship songs, and our ancestors were the true worship leaders of much of the majority of early American history. And that's because like white Christianity in America was flawed. Like its root,
Very flawed, yeah.
its root is it's evil in America. It's an evil root. And so if you don't ever deal with the root, like any denominational structure that has not taken time, like that is a predominantly white denominational structure that has not taken the time to delve into and to discuss and deal with racism and their history, you are pressing into a reality that is like, or a history that is inherently evil, that utilize the Pauline writings and, you know, the New Testament, utilizing even Old Testament narratives of people owning slaves and things like that in order to perpetuate this perceived standing of black people, right? But then also, going back and like taking a story like the Curse of Ham, right, in Noah, and utilizing that as some sort of idea that black is inherently cursed, like our lineage, our history is to be cursed.
Yeah, man.
And so, you know, especially for someone like you who is in an interracial marriage, married to a white woman, that even in Tennessee to this day, till this day, like whole Deontay Wilder situation, like that text is used by preachers. There's a preacher who's in East Tennessee down the street from that preaches at a fairly large church, down the street from my seminary, my alma mater at this point, that preach messages about why interracial marriages are not of God, and utilize that Curse of Ham text as a reference point to spew that hateful ideology. And so you have like that heritage of hate. You have the heritage of hate that's embedded in policing. Like Southern police, this isn't all police in America in terms of the roots, but many Southern police departments' direct roots came from slave patrols. It's factual. Like you can't get away from it. It's you can play this historical revisionist history type situation to be able to wash that away. But if you look at the history of, plenty of Southern police departments, slave patrols are where that played out, because in the North, you're not having enslaved peoples. And so, in most Northern spaces. And so that's not how they started, but you have a bunch of other issues that exist within that. And so you got that, but then you also have the reality that like police departments, like police are called law enforcement for a reason. They are enforcing the law. So when the law is racist, they're enforcing racism. So it's racism. Like police are inherently, we're inherently enforcing that, and then continue to inherently enforce racism and racist policies within a systemically oppressing system, within a racist system, because police have to take an oath to enforce the law. So if the law is they don't get to make the law and check the law and change the law. They have to enforce the law. And if there's societal makeups, set up in order to continue in cycles of oppression, you're just going to play into the systems of oppression. It's why certain judges like quit and things like that, when they were stuck having to sentence people on their third strike, to 25 to life because of, what the Clinton administration put in with a 3 strikes law. So you've got like the heritage of hate that sits in that. You got the heritage of hate of the Confederate Army and the South within that space, and how if you look at their roots, you just have to read their founding documents. You just have to listen to listen to the foundational speech, the cornerstone speech from the Vice President of the Confederacy, who says straight up that the Confederacy is hinged upon the idea that the Negro is lesser than the white man. Like this is this foundational cornerstone ideology of the Confederacy. And if you don't know what a cornerstone is, that's a very important load-bearing part to a foundation of a building, right? And so you see heritage of hate play out, within this space of what I'm talking about, when it comes to the Confederacy and the heritage not hate Confederate Army situation and stuff. But you also see this heritage of hate play out in what racism looks like in America. Like this, there's a heritage that is inherited that must be dealt with, that must be made new, must be reformed, must see with new eyes, because it has touched every aspect of American life, of US American life. You can't get away from it. And so then what are you going to do with it? That's the real question,
Yeah. I think the big question is, how do we move forward? One of the things I always say, especially in the church, man, is that to Black brothers and sisters and the teachers of the scriptures, is it's not up to you to justify your experience. Your story is sacred. Simply because, man, a lot of times what happens is tokenism happens, and you're out here sharing your story about how awful it was to be a Black male or Black woman in America. And you're expending so much emotional energy trying to have people understand that this is a real thing and not a made up experience. And you end up traumatized from it, and I think that's one of the things that, for me, looking at heritage of hate, your spoken word was, my heart started to beat. It was almost this traumatic, when you see a symbol such as a Confederate flag, you already know, it's probably not going to be a peaceable conversation. You know what I'm saying? It's not going to, we're not going to leave on the same page here. And not that we have to all the time, but on average, what that says is a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding the humanity in others. And the sad thing is that the church is learning a lot from our world on what it means to see the Imago Dei in every person. And that's not even a sad thing, but it's just that's and the reason why I say that, to qualify that statement, is simply this is the basis of our faith. If anything, Jesus was a prophet that spoke truth to power and loved the marginalized. That literally is the faith of Christianity. That there will be a kingdom where there's not oppression, where there's an understanding and love for all people who look different and who come from different places, and that heaven will come on earth, and that we partner with God to cultivate this beautiful Garden of Eden-like city together. And I think if that is our faith, the fact that we as Christians, no matter what color you are, or ethnic background, or nationality, or race you are, that we are just as polarized as culture is pretty outrageous to me, you know. And I'm not saying we have it all figured out, but like at the very least, follow Jesus's ethic, where he honored experiences. The idea of honoring experiences is not you know, it's just, unfortunately, again, right, it's not the American way. The idea of empathy is not the American way, right? It just is not. It's kind of what America has seen, especially over the last 30 years, in workaholics, where people are becoming depressed and actually killing themselves because they're overworking, or people are dying from overworking, from extending themselves past their limitation as human beings. The idea of objectification, pornography is skyrocketing. The idea of poverty. I mean, you look at San Francisco, you look at, anywhere really, but specifically these kind of city centers that are high priced and continue to push people out. But it's this idea of there's a lack of understanding for humanity, and a lack of understanding for what it meant to be the Imago Dei. What does it mean to see the image of God, beautiful creation in others? And that's really, theological and maybe even philosophical at some level. But the idea of what it means to be a Christian is to serve and not to be served, and to relinquish power, to be powerless, and to be in solidarity with those who don't have it. And so I think it's just interesting, kind of, and this is what I'm talking about. Like, I think we really have to address the history of America, because embedded in that history is very much Puritans and Pilgrims, and the idea of the beautiful Thanksgiving feast that, we were all taught growing up. But yet when you do the history, you don't want to recite that Thanksgiving feast with the Pilgrims and the Indians, because it's not an ideal story. And so, but when we start that way, and then also whenever we continue to have this thread of good old American Christianity, what it does is that spirituality is so near and dear to us. Spirituality is probably one of the most intimate things that we have as people. And trying to have people understand that have been raised in this, blonde hair, blue-eyed, nice-skinned Jesus, which is so outrageous, right? I mean, it just makes no sense that that's who Jesus would be, but it is apparently, painted in pictures. But when you have people who are raised in that environment and don't know anything other than that environment of this weird quasi-Christianity that has a kingdom of only people who look like them, then you get into this place where we are in this polarized faith community where you're almost called to justify your experience at all times. You're almost called to justify why you don't like Jonathan Edwards, as a Black male. You're almost called to justify why, I ask the question all the time, why do we celebrate the Protestant Reformation so much when, like, people were dying over doctrinal views? Like people were literally killing others over doctrinal views.
Yeah.
Like that is these ideas of a history of hatred, of a history of polarization, of a history of dehumanization, you know, a history of all these things, that all you are is just a pile of beliefs. and and I can argue and say whatever I want to say to you and not honor your humanity, is the symptom of what America has birthed. And I think, you know, to be honest, man, I really don't even, you know, I'm an optimistic skeptic on how to move forward, but I really don't even know.
Yeah.
You know, I really don't know what the road is for us.
Yeah, I mean, because there's like larger kind of spaces where we have to try to, you know, take aim at dismantling certain systems and reforming certain spaces. You know, I think like with the church, right? You can have, even if your congregation is diverse, like even if your congregation is filled with people of different backgrounds, socioeconomically, racially, etc., right? That does not necessarily mean that you're actually listening to the voices or trying to be an inclusive space of the different voices that sit within your church body. Because like, you can have white culture dominating a church experience that has a bunch of different people in it, because there's not a leveling of like, let's create a culture that is uniquely the embodiment of all of our cultures, because then you still see like a domination of white male power in churches. You like
lack of women in leadership and justification for it.
Yeah, lack of women in leadership, lack of diversity in leadership. You know, there's just so then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, just because it's I'm not saying that it's scripted to be like this. I'm just saying that it continues to prevail, and there's not enough efforts to fix these sort of situations. And so the perspective becomes inherently white and inherently white male. And it does not include this diversity of voices. And it does not include the diversity of culture. And so then it just feels like it just creates a space where weekly people are spending, you know, if they're serving at a church, right, they're spending upwards to 4 hours a week at a church, you know, on a Sunday morning, where everything that they're getting fed is from a lens that is solely white and is carrying parts of the burden of what we talked about before, of the fact that, like, you know, white folks, like white church denominations that don't deal with the history of racism within their own spaces, are carrying with them a continued legacy of racism and white supremacy within the ways that they're operating, because that faith is inherently flawed. You know, it's inherently from a corrupt root, you know. Because you can say like, oh, our root is Jesus, and it's like, no, you have to still contextualize where the heck you're at. You have to contextualize, like, you know, that people still be like throwing up Pax Romana, you know, symbolism, which the Pax Romana, like, symbolism is like this Constantine, like Emperor Constantine shift, where there's this idea of the Constantinian shift, if people don't know about that. And basically, like, Constantine had some dream and basically had this idea of like painting this symbol of what is a rho in Greek, but looks like a P to us who are American, and then an X at the bottom of it. And it was to represent Christianity, because the X at the bottom is a key in Greek as well. And so it's like to represent like Christianity or Christ, and they painted that on the front of their shields, and they won this battle. And so they're like, whoa, Jesus.
Jesus, yep.
The miracle of my violence persisting, you know?
Yeah.
And so then Constantine made the state-sponsored religion of Rome, of the empire, into Christianity. And so then that happens, and it plays into the Crusades. It plays into like now Christianity from going from being a religion or a set of beliefs or a faith structure that is for marginalized and oppressed peoples of the most oppressed group of people in that area, is for the least of these, right? Now being this, religion that is co-opted by the power holders who are utilizing it as a way to oppress. And so we still see fixation on the symbols at times in like modern Christian culture, maybe just because how it looks, but like, I mean, I've got Logos Bible software, right? And like, if you open Logos, and I've got like the older one because I got it after I graduated from college, and it was like a graduation present from my pops and some of his side of the family, and you see like a Pax Romana like symbol on like the home page of the app, and then like there's an artist that I follow who's a filmmaker, and some of the symbolism, I don't know if it was just for his particular project and he might have been trying to create a certain like narrative with that I might not have peered well enough into, but I just remember seeing these like Pax Romana symbol popping up in his stuff. And I think that there's a fixation on some of those things, like, and there's a reality that this is a root that stuff is coming from. People are coming from, like, your Christianity is tied to this stuff, and if you're not unearthing it, you're not dealing with it, you're gonna keep perpetuating it. Like, the seminary that I went to is Christian Church, which is a denomination, and it's interesting. Independent Christian churches. And I say it's interesting from the sense that like people are like, wait, everybody's Christian church, and it's like, well, their denomination is Christian church, like but Baptists are Christians too, but like people who are
the divisions, man.
Yeah, Lutherans are Christians too, like, and it's like, no, we're a Christian church. And so, but with the Christian church, you don't have to go far back to Christian church history, like go in the civil rights movement of this movement, this Stone Campbell movement of churches, and like they sucked during that time. Like they didn't do, like, there was no like true solidarity effort within that space, and they had mixed signals that were happening. Like they had a conference in the mid 60s that they basically said that we're not integrating churches, and like Black people aren't allowed to speak and communicate our spaces. But then at the same time, like, another Christian church was like asking a Black man to come speak in the space. And then the school that owns my seminary, that like, bought out the seminary a couple years back, like close to the beginning when I started, Milligan University now, Milligan didn't integrate until the late 60s. And so like Milligan has a history, Milligan has a legacy, like there's stuff that Milligan has to deal with and rock through. I don't even think that Milligan has, I don't even know that Milligan has a full-time Black staff member. And maybe if they do, they have like one. And so these are realities where, like, even if your space has a diversity of people, even if the diversity of your church reflects the even if the diversity of your church reflects the dynamics and demographics of your community, it's still, you might still be pumping in just white American Christian ideologies, and in a lot of those spaces they're not dealing with racism. Like they're not talking about those things. Like a lot of places have been forced to in this season, right? But now that Minneapolis isn't burning, even though we're just walking through like just a couple of days after Jacob Blake was shot by the police.
Yeah.
that, like the Wisconsin
in the
riots,
back.
right? Yeah, the Wisconsin riots right now aren't at the scale that what Minneapolis was, what that international outrage was. And so, there are likely, spaces that aren't talking. And there are some spaces that are like, we're committed to this work and to undo some of this stuff and look within ourselves and see our own racism and diversify voices and educate and stuff like that. There are places that are doing that, but there are a lot of places that aren't dealing with that stuff. And if you're not dealing with it, you're going to continue to perpetuate a heritage of hate. You're going to continue to perpetuate a heritage that makes Black people feel unwelcome and experience racism in your spaces and not be heard and not have efforts to be the forefront movement of change. And the last thing I'll say within this is like, you look at Dr. King, right? And you look at, it's like, I know that there were a lot of different movements and stuff that were a part of the civil rights movement. But I also think that without Black Christians in the civil rights movement, we would not have made as much of the headway as we did in certain areas and spaces because of the Southern Christian Leadership Convention.
Yeah.
But even even within that, I will say that we have to look within the flaws within that structure too, because I don't think that they cared for and elevated the voices of Black women well at all. There was like, to even have a Black woman speak at the March on Washington was a last ditch effort that was done really within a really rushed way. And Black women were often like trying to were critiquing some of the ways that, Martin and that crew were moving and not elevating more voices of women within that space, because they're
mothers of the movement, so to speak.
Yeah. And their dynamics were just a little bit more, they were more conservative in the space of like progressive ideology that would say like women can be pastors and that women's only places are like their ideology sat more within like women in the space of submission, because their theology is a lot more conservative, a lot more reformed, rather than a more progressive ideology that would see women in the pulpit and different things like that, which is interesting because you got someone like his daughter Bernice, like who's preaching and doing all sorts of work within the space of justice. And I've listened to her preach a couple times, and I think that she's a really dynamic communicator. But anyways, I dominated that for a second.
No, you're good. I would say the last thing I want to say is without acknowledgement, so public sins require public confession. And I think a lot of people are not willing to do that. One, because there's a fear of giving up something. There's a fear of being wrong. There's a fear of lamenting, I would even say. Lament is uncomfortable. What has gone on for everybody, with no exception, with COVID-19 has been a time of uncomfortability. You're either at home all the time, you're by yourself all the time, you can't go hang out with friends whenever you want to, you can't go to the gym, you can't, it has been uncomfortable, right? And I think there's this desire to get back to normal. There's this desire for Southern heritage to get back to the old America. Yeah, there's this desire for everything just to be okay.
Make America great again. Continue.
Yeah, right.
Because it holds on nostalgia.
Yeah, and there, because those times were better, they were greater, right? And in a like a hyper individualistic culture, that makes sense, right? because you're only thinking about your experience, right? So I mean, if you want to make America great again, you know what that means. You know, like you you know what that means. It just is what it is, right? Because you can't make it great again because it was never, like for Black people. But I even say as a nation, right? It was never a great nation in the sense of like we killed a lot of people, we killed our own citizens, we oppress, of course, as we know, Black Americans. Like that, like these ideas permeate who we are now. And in this pandemic, I've seen, man, this desire to get back to normal, when the reality is normal is not normal. It will never be normal. It will never be what we know is normal. And we look at that sometimes as a bad thing, but it's like, no, it's not. Like, I think what has happened right now has given a chance at new life, has given a chance at new progress that we would have never had before. And I think if our world didn't stop for however long. Now, am I saying the handling of what happened with coronavirus was okay? No, I'm not saying that. I think it was very poor. But what I am saying, though, is that this unintended space of multiple months where we are sitting with our own thoughts, to where we can't put Band-Aids on bullet wounds anymore because eventually they'll begin to bleed out, to where we can't just keep pushing, right? We can't just move past it and not address it. No, we are having to come to grips with history. We're having to come to grips with the reality of what America is today. And I think everybody should be asking the question on like, how do we move forward? How do we move forward in legislation? How do we move forward in the church, right? If that's where you are. How do you move forward in your workplace if that's where you are? How do you move forward? What is building as a Black community? What does building generational wealth look like? How do we go about these things? How do we begin to teach our kids about stocks? How do we begin to teach our kids about coding? How do we begin to teach our about all these things that that at some level will continue to, because I believe as Black people, we are the most resilient people in America. And that's no shade thrown. It's just, I would say historically, right? The resilience of Black Americans and my ancestors, man, is outrageous. I'm enamored whenever I just go down the line of Black leaders that have spoken, Black women that have spoken, like in the midst of oppression, in the midst of being beat up, and also those who are linking arms with Black Americans. I don't want to downplay the pivotal contributions of white Americans, man, and white and brown and Black Americans as we win the civil rights movement. When you see walking on the bridge, and it was people of all colors on the Selma Bridge, and I think, yeah, man, we just have to be asking the question of how do we move forward here, and what does that look like? Because I believe resilience will continue with the Black community. I believe we will continue to progress and move forward. But I do believe that there are things that need to change. And what I'm praying for, man, as the church, is that we would give space for laments, but also we would publicly confess historically what Christianity in America has been, because largely it's been assimilation. Largely it's been evangelism in the Constantine era, which would have been more assimilation, that we would, share the faith with the enslaved or the prisoners of war, and try to assimilate them to our culture. And a lot of Christianity it retains its roots from that idea. Especially when you look at, even there's still the Christian organization called Cru. I don't know why that was ever a good name. You
mean Campus Crusade for Christ?
Yeah, Campus Crusade for Christ. But now they're called Cru. It was just like, it's still this idea of like, hey, like how we addressed historically, which I think they're doing better. They're doing better now by addressing their history. But I think a lot of what we're seeing is that we're having to confront our life, having to confront history, and having to confront reality in different ways. And I'm excited for the future.
Interestingly enough, I was a part of crew in college, and I still like there are friends that I have that are on crew staff.
Yeah, for sure.
That I financially support. And yeah, I remember the conversation, because I've done a couple mission project type joints with crew back in the day. And I remember like how they were talking about like Campus Crusade for Christ, like with trying to go into other countries. It wasn't a good look, because like it caused this like instant like, kind of trauma, like this relived trauma surrounding the Crusades. And it's like, what the heck are you coming here for? What are you doing? And so then they switched the name to Crew. And I remember like they had us like watch a talk. I think like Francis Chan was the one speaking or something, like where they unveiled this new name. And I think, like you said, I think Crew is pressing into some of those conversations surrounding that more than they had. But I also don't know how Crew, like the inner workings of Crew are or anything like that. And I know that like Crew is a lot different than me in terms of like theologically, like they're a lot more reformed than I am. But it is the necessity to be a space that is taking steps towards like how do you like allow yourself to be transformed by love? Like how do you allow yourself to be transformed by the true message of the gospel? And to look at America, or the United States of America. I've been trying not to say America just outright, because America is a lot more than the United States. There's North America and there's South America, and North America includes Mexico and Canada and stuff, right? And so I've been trying to say like US Americans, like to try not to like continue playing into this like America first ideology, that has been like thrusted on us our entire existence here, because there is a reality that even as Black Americans or Black US Americans, that we are still subject to the map that shows America bigger, proportionally than a lot of spaces, and it shows it first, and different things like that keep trying to push this like ideology that America's the greatest country ever, we're better than everyone else, woo, make America great again. But yeah, I think how I'll kind of like wrap this is, I don't care what space we're talking about. I don't care if we're talking about liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, if we're talking Christian, non-Christian, whomever, right? Racism has permeated all sides. The DNC just happened, and I don't really think they really addressed any of our concerns. And I know that the Republicans and the Republican National Convention are just bugging and saying all sorts of out of pocket stuff right now. And I've seen some of the clips of it, and they're saying all sorts of out of pocket stuff, and they're not going to address Black concerns. And the DNC is like, just like, we're going to say, like, I'm going to just sprinkle a little bit of, I met Gianna Floyd, or I, touched on this topic, or, I'm going to acknowledge that systemic oppression exists or something like that, rather than actually like, formulating a plan or rocking through our actual demands, right?
Yeah.
And so on all spaces, this stuff has permeated. So it's an effort of like, especially white folks, because white folks are the dominant culture in America and have been the power holders in America, especially white males historically. And for like all of us to have an understanding of like our history, what the heck's going on, and then press into those spaces and understand the heritage, because you ain't gonna have no response for somebody saying heritage not hate if you don't have an understanding of the history. And then it's like, how do you work towards a future that acknowledges the past, right? That actually has an understanding of it, so you don't continue to make those mistakes in the future. Because history repeats itself is not just some cliche thing that doesn't actually play out. Like, history repeats itself. Like, it just evolves. The war on drugs was an evolution of racism. Mass incarceration was an evolution of racism. You know, voter suppression is an evolution of racism. And so to have an understanding of how these things continue to evolve, and how you have to be aware of moments that might seem trivial, like the situation that I had in this Lowe's parking lot, and how that plays into a larger narrative, and how that plays into how people look at stuff, and gaslighting people in like Black folks in terms of their experience and stuff like that. To grow in an understanding of what that's like, and then make moves to create change, to stand strong, to stand in a space of power and say, you will not again enslave me. The city was long ago made free. Like, my freedom is not tied to you, you know, and I'm going to stand strong, and I will not again be held down in the power of your oppression. And now I'm going to work to, you know, I have to work to free others, to make freedom a real thing, to make equity and equality a real thing in our world, in our nation, and in the lives of other people. And it starts at home. It starts at the places that you can touch right now. And then and we can make, you know, we can vote, we can make these larger systemic moves and, you know, democracy-based moves. But it also is going to have to start at your local church, at your job, at your kid's school, at your school, at all these different spots, right? In order to create a change that is equitable and equal for all of us. So yeah, dog, I appreciate you for taking the time to do this today, man. I appreciate it all. It was a great conversation. Appreciate y'all for listening to this today. Stay tuned for Monday for the next drop in the series of City of God, and then see you in a week for the next episode of Durag Thoughts, where we'll be talking about whatever track drops on Monday. And I'll catch you on the flip. Be easy, be safe. Peace.